Someone had brought George a modern trailer and set it up beside his house, advising him to move into it to avoid county intervention and an old people's home. It was an answer to another of his deepest worries, but he didn't want to move out of his house. At his suggestion, I moved into the trailer. This worked for me because mornings, by George's time, started early. He had set ideas about people sleeping after 6. After Pearl found Clem asleep in a pile of hay in broad daylight, George didn't want to hear of him. Before fixing George's breakfast, I made the rounds, getting the cowboys up to feed the horses. Randy and Larry had more grump and grouch than I could talk them out of, so I just beat on their doors and a stick. After feeding the horses, they'd come bickering back to the house to eat. Early morning was a cussing crisis, and George was right in the middle of it. He hated their cigarette smoke that filled up the house. One day he got so mad he couldn't speak for an hour. Then he reiterated, "My mother always told me, if you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything at all. Goddamn sons of bitches." When George was irritated, his jaw jutted forward, and when he was frustrated, his face got red. He wanted to work. He'd always worked. We worked on getting him to slow down and relax. One day he snapped at me, "I can't get much slower." He fixed bridles at a workbench in the house, but sometimes that irked him more. Once I heard him cussing in his room, so I knocked and opened his door to see him with shaving cream all over the front of his white sling undershirt, the broken aerosol can still spurting at his feet. Another day, while he was getting dressed and mentally giving somebody hell, he'd picked up a bottle of cough syrup instead of hair tonic. Boy, was he mad. He hated anything sticky. I laughed, wiping his head with a wet cloth, and told him that that's what he got for getting mad. But I hugged him, and pretty soon he considered the cough syrup incident funny himself. That's how it was with him. That was typical of George's relationship with most of us girls, one of mutual fondness and respect. Despite his bouts of cantankerousness, he was repulsed by our idea that he quit shaving. He joked that if he grew a beard, honey would get in it, and then bees would be attracted to build a hive. By the time he was done embellishing this story, large species of wildlife had taken up residence, so a beard for him was out of the question. His worries were many, but it usually didn't take much to wrest his focus. He worried about the girls in the desert, and I told him what I was told about their adventure. The desert at dusk was magical. The mountains erupting in buff pink, pale yellow, and mint green, with dramatic stripes of purple, blue, gold, and red. It was awesome in the true meaning of the word. At Indian Ranch near sundown, I saw my first coyote. There weren't many tourists in the desert, but people passed through it on their way to Nevada or elsewhere, and older vehicles had water-cooled radiators that boiled over and needed refills. About 30 miles from Cappy's grandmother's, Indian Ranch was like an information center where travelers could get water, sodas, directions, and historical background. As the desert cooled, I walked out of the main building to take in the view, and I stopped. The coyote was in the brush just a few yards away. I felt surprise and some fear. I think it did too. As maligned as the coyote is, it is actually a lithe, beautiful animal. After a moment's pause, it furtively trotted away. Charlie once said that he was spiritually allied with the coyote, and coyote in Native American mythology is a trickster, a very powerful god-like being. Many Indian gods were not flat cutouts, good or bad, but multi-sided, a concept that Christians find difficult to understand. A long time ago, George told me, we had pumpkins growing on a hill out back. Then a hard rain loosed the soil around them, and they commenced to rolling downhill. Oh no. Yep. And there was a visitor in the little house with the quarter moon on it. And sure enough, pumpkins hit the side of that house and we bowled it over. A second or two passed while I processed this. One of these days, he said, we ought to go down there and see if that man needs any help. George was shamelessly amused by the corniness of his own jokes. That's what made them funny. I was surprised to learn that George had a wife. She arrived one afternoon carrying a covered casserole and George's shirts from the professional laundry. She was slight and seemed older than him, having short white curls and a disapproving expression. Barely speaking, she went straight into his room to tuck his clothes into dresser drawers. After reclosing his door, she picked up the casserole and seemed hesitant to leave it. Quietly, she told him where she would place it. They shared a few words out of my hearing. He stood up, reached in his pocket for some carefully folded money, gave it to her, and she left. This happened each time I was present when she visited, and that was maybe 4 or 5 times during the many months we were on the ranch. George told me that they had separated because she had never agreed to stay on the ranch, and he didn't want to leave it. I took in George's memories as they were offered. Had I been wiser, I would have delved for details. He told me about movie making in old Hollywood, like about tripwires used to make horses and mules look drunk. They were long, thin wires tied to the legs of the animals and stretched to where the movie company men off camera can pull them side to side. And he also told me about a legendary cowgirl performer who, while on her horse, dove from a high platform into a wooden vat of water. I asked if the horses in either of those situations could be injured or killed, and he said seriously that they could. But he hadn't heard of it happening. Only a handful of George's horses were used for movies, but all were plump and healthy, many with names like Bonnie and Fred and Sue. They were grain-fed in winter and hay-fed all year round. The shoesmith came every 6 months, and the vet once a year. Beyond that, George counted on the cowboys to check their hooves and treat them for saddle sores. "Never leave this grain bin open again," Pearl scolded Larry, slamming it for emphasis. "You could have killed one of them." Each horse in winter got 1 can of oats per week. Given the chance to eat from the bin, they would bloat and founder. Pearl told Larry he'd be up all night forcing sick horses to drink castor oil, while Randy cursed him and plunged a gloved arm up to the elbow in equine behind. If a foundered horse didn't pass the grain within a day, it could go lame or die. George said that some years before he had awakened at night, sensing that a mare in the foaling pen needed help to deliver her colt. He called from his porch until his throat hurt and beat the stair rail with his cane, but he could not arouse a single ranch hand. Then he was angry. He went back to his room, his heart hot, pulled his work pants over his pajamas, and put on socks and shoes, wiped the sweat from his face, and wondered if the cowboys were already with the mare. But as he felt his way with his cane down the boardwalk to the foaling pen, he knew they were not there. And although he would have liked to have cussed and fired them then and there, as he imagined them out drinking or sleeping or hiding from him, he could hear the mare breathing heavily. Leaving his cane parked by a fence, he felt along splintered wood to the gate latch and let himself in the pen, telling the mare to be steady. He could smell and hear her breathing below him. He told her that he would help her. He stooped and found a small set of hooves, and, listening to the cues from its mother, he pulled that little colt into the world. It was clear by the relief he expressed in telling his story that the success of his experience had softened his fury at the cowboys. But he reinstated it when he was through, just to keep stock of it. Sandy. The desert was so quiet that we could hear breezes. One of us found a young owl, and Charlie put it in what might have been a chicken's nesting box, and checked on it until it could fly away. Lizards, rabbits, snakes, ground squirrels, birds, and all kinds of wildlife were moving in the brush. But it took weeks of getting used to the quiet for the chatter in our minds to be upstaged by nature. One time, while Charlie and I drove out of the desert to pick up Lynn, he told me to look at objects and say out loud their names like bush, burrow, boulder, rock, raven. I knew that the rapid naming of things was his attempt to bring me out and keep me from falling back into the morass of my mind. It is a self-truth to me that the little things of the mind and in the soul grind the rocks to sand and feed shellfish, and that the snails carry the universe, and the bugs are not fools, and that all does communicate. But if you've ruled in your head, the wall school put up cuts your awareness down. I don't remember leaving George in someone else's care or the drive to the desert, but I recall that climbing into the mountains through Goler Wash was not easy. Besides the extra exertion, the starkness, after busy streets and towns, was a shock to my senses. From the numbing silence to our alternately muffled and echoed voices, it was a different experience in perception. The maze of the wash seemed never-ending, with no landmarks to note our progress, only more sand, more boulders, more dry brush, and the rock walls that flanked us looking like stern-faced American Indians, and different to our small, struggling bodies. Once up and out of the wash, we could see miles of smooth hills and distant mountains. The bare landscape was a clean palette for the evening's soft watercolors. In reality, neither soft nor wet. The desert is harsh. The rocks are hard, the plants prickly, and the need for water startling. It is so dry that rare rainwater reaching the earth rolls off its back downhill. Yet plants grow in the desert and animals thrive. If you know where to look, there are potholes in stone that catch rain, covert waterholes, and sunny oases fed by freshwater springs. But you could search for days and die before finding any. Charlie made it his priority to know them. At last we reached the ranch left by the late Mr. Barker to his wife, who believed in making it available to prospectors and travelers needing temporary shelter. During our brief stays, we met and heard about people past and present who shared an affinity for the desert. Some were well educated, some never. Some had jobs and homes in cities, and some were among the most outlandish hermits in tarnation. While out hiking, we met the bristle-bearded prospector known as Ballarat Bob, on his way to Barker's. Bob traveled the desert with only his two burros, Billy and Jenny, for company, so maybe he wasn't accustomed to talking, especially to women. I couldn't tell if he was brusque or bashful. By appearances, Bob sought valuable ores, but I think it was as good an excuse as any for him to get away from the rest of civilization. While we slept in Barker's main house, he stayed in the nearby bunkhouse, the burros corralled. Just outside his door, braying to the answering mountains. They were especially suited to the terrain and climate, and may have once been part of a wild herd, but burros are not native to California deserts, and conservationists would later try to remove all the wild ones from the landscape. Throughout Barker's front yard, between cactus and rock gardens, were interesting pieces of junk. Rusty wheels and mechanical parts, a dented fuselage from a plane crash, a box containing minerals and ores. The guys were learning from the prospectors to recognize different ores. They had other more destructive recreations like a motor scooter and a tin can target for pellet guns. Maybe a couple of 22s, but I'd say that they spent the majority of their time exploring what must be a geologist's dream. There are different types of rock layered together and patterns in the cliffs showing that there once was water. In a nearby valley, a mammoth butte, bigger than the town of Ballarat, has diagonal strata that may indicate its having been thrown upon its side during some cataclysm before our species arrived. While our parents' generation was looking to outer space, we were far from done exploring the earth. It seemed that the desert was on the edge of both. Lying on our backs outside at night, we could see more stars and planets than we had ever seen at one time. Shooting stars, meteors, and things to wonder about. On a distant dark hill, a tiny light pinpointed the cabin where an astrophysicist engineer lived with his wife. Clem and Charlie had visited Clint and Stella Anderson, and Clem returned to see them several times. As I understood, Clint had invented a device for the United States military having something to do with the laser, light amplification stimulated emission radiation, and his invention had been patented by his employer. Whatever brought Clint and his wife to a lone cabin in this rough country, Clem said that they loved the desert. Rattlesnakes, scorpions, coyotes, and all. Clint told him that they were nearly out of supplies. He had taken out a rifle to kill a rabbit, but when at last he saw one, he couldn't shoot it because it looked like a friend of his. I used to squat on Clint Anderson's kitchen floor while he ran down to me universal laws, celestial concepts that my mind could barely grasp. I was intoxicated with the wine of his wisdom and knowledge. He was gently humble, as if plugged into and talking for the whole magnificent universe. I walked out of his little desert cottage with the top of my head gone and my brain touching the heavens. One time, when I was leaving the Andersons, after bringing them a heap of goodies and supplies, they told me that if I ever feel a touch like a spring breeze on my shoulder and soft whisperings, to know that it's them in spirit visiting me. I've felt those feelings several times through the years, and one time found out that Clint had passed. They were magical. Circa 1973, letter to Lynn and Sandy. Early mornings, before most of us were awake, Bo made cornmeal tortillas on the potbelly stove and hand-fed the first batch to Ballarat Bob's 2 burros. One morning she didn't bring breakfast soon enough to suit them, so Billy or Jenny stepped on the porch, turned the doorknob by use of teeth, and we awoke to see him or her standing in the kitchen. Bo made the tortillas for us too. I would call them burritos, but they weren't packing much. We ate them with ketchup. We ate them with syrup. We ate them with salt, and we ate them plain. If you don't see the pattern here, we were eating almost nothing but Bo's tortillas because the rest of the food was gone. 5 of us girls volunteered to go to Las Vegas. It was the closest city, and a straight shot on the back road through Shoshone. Dennis hadn't used Juanita's Dodge van, and now we had a use for it. But Dennis had already given it to a persistent groupie whose father could have bought her 10 vans. I don't know how, but Charlie got it back. You know there's less than a quarter tank of gas in this thing, he said quietly when we were seated in the van. We did know. The closest mining camp was 20 miles away. We each had no more than a change of clothes, a toothbrush, a towel, and maybe a knife. All the guys came out and stood around the van, smiling at us with their hands in their pockets. Between them, they provided us about $1.70. As an afterthought, they devilishly siphoned a gallon of gas from the tank to use for their scooter, and we were sent off with only one instruction: have a good trip. Not far from Barker's, we got stuck on rocks, got out of the van, and struggled to free it. For nearly the entire dirt road out, we had to clear big rocks. At dusk, we rested. In one of the van's cupboards, we found a can of sweetened condensed milk. It was our only food until we reached Las Vegas. We woke once during the night and saw a band of high-tailed burros running and kicking under the stars. Our next day was similar to the first. Lifting rocks, shifting rocks, pulling and pushing rocks, pushing the van, breathing hard, sweating, and laughing. Finally, we reached the mining camp. The people there gave us just a little gas since their supply was low. But beyond the dirt road, the going was easier. The asphalt looked like a wavy black banner. Up and down hills all the way to the main road to Las Vegas. To save gas, Brenda cut the engine at the crest of a hill, and we coasted down it and part way up the next. Rocking our bodies in unison further propelled us to another hilltop so we could coast down again. This tactic saved us enough gas to drive the long, flat stretch into the electrified city. In Las Vegas, Juanita traded her van for a Jeep at a car dealership, and we went to the big food warehouses where workers carted cases of canned, bottled, and dry foods to back docks and loaded them into the Jeep. Some of the men broke cartons open so they could account for the loss as damaged goods. All we said was that we were feeding hungry people in the desert. We drove back to Barker's with hardly any space for us to sit. Holiday season brought hunters, miners, campers, and even the military used the road that went by Barker's. When people came around, most of the younger girls stepped into the back room and closed the door, while the adults waved, spoke, or even served coffee around the kitchen table. Charlie had gotten permission from Mrs. Barker for Mary, himself, and their kids to stay at the ranch. But Mrs. B didn't know how many kids they had. Some of us moved to Grandma's up the road, yet Cappy was half expecting to see Grandma. What if her family had decided to take a vacation? Weesh was the fastest runner, so she stayed on point at Barker's to alert the people at Grandma's of possible company. She told me later she hadn't heard a Jeep engine until it was nearly next to the house. She yelled to the people in Barker's kitchen, "You guys make a front. Stall 'em." As she swooshed away over the high path, while down below, Sandy flagged 2 men in the Jeep. It slowed, they waved and drove on. Leaping downhill to Grandma's, Weesh yelled, "Jeep!" to Clem and Charlie, then dove headfirst under a bush into what she called an amazing world of spiders and their spinnings. She heard the blood pounding in her ears and felt trickles of sweat on her face. Or was it spiders? She was so close to the road that she couldn't move. The Jeep idled outside Granny's. She heard the bass voices of men. At last, the voices turned to bold yet restrained chuckles, and the men drove away. Brenda, Gypsy, Mary, I, and at least one of the younger girls left Barker's ranch on foot for Spawn's ranch about midday. Not packing much. Ballarat was a mere 27 miles, but by sundown, that 27 seemed like 100. 7 miles down the wash, our feet hurt through our flimsy shoes, and the makeshift packs got to weighing more with every step as dusk settled over us in one cold blanket. On the dirt road to Ballarat, we slowed to a trudge. Hours later, I lagged behind and saw dark robots without knee joints rocking foot to foot, inch by inch. We couldn't stop to spend the night. It was too cold. During one rest, our blood slowed. We struggled to light matches that illuminated our fat purple fingers. Knowing the pain and getting up that time and the deep temptation to sleep, we rested little afterward, and bend after bend after bend there was no sight of Ballarat until there was, around the curve of the foothills, a tiny light. As we shuffled into town groaning, all appeared to be sleeping. We rang a buzzer. A hired hand came out and told us to follow him to the Mrs.'s trailer. Waking and bundling, she appeared angry. A big-boned, gray-haired woman in a wool shirt and baggy pants. Sternly, she told us to follow. We tried, but we couldn't keep up. She stopped and turned around, looking at us. Then her stony expression lifted and she laughed. She was a desert treasure, rough and rare. She put us up in a wood storage shack with 2 springy beds, plenty of wool blankets, 2 quarts of milk, cheese, crackers, and candy bars from her store. Then she went away. She seemed to know what we liked and that we couldn't pay. Full and grateful, we dropped to sleep before finishing the meal. In the morning, Ballarat was busy. Rugged miners were eating at the short counter inside the store. Our host was cooking. She barely said a word to us, set us up a breakfast of oatmeal and milk, and got us a ride out of town. From Spawn's ranch we separated, each of us with tasks at the fountain or in getting supplies for a return to the desert. I went back to the trailer beside George's house. I had discreetly passed on what George told me about his owing over $3,000 in taxes. Juanita had written home for money she had in trust or savings, and when it came, she offered the entire amount for our use, over $11,000. Charlie told me that he caught himself thinking he could triple the money by investing in cars, girls, or even horses. But that was just an old ego, he said. Thanks to Juanita, George got the money to pay off his back taxes, penalties and all. And after Katie reported that the Fountain of the World badly needed to get their truck repaired, Juanita's money bought them a new truck. I was sitting on George's steps when Cowboy Bill approached, so I saw him from the ground up. Scuffed cowboy boots, long legs, short hair. He was rough around the edges and looked older than he probably was, smiling down on me paternally like he already knew me. I was suspicious. Resting a boot on the stoop, he paused before going inside. I haven't seen George in years, he told me. And by the way, how's Charlie? That cinched it. I figured him for a cop, but he lit a cigarette and continued. Charlie and I go way back. We were in the joint together down south. You know what we used to do in the hole? Now he had my interest. Whoever had smokes would tie a cigarette, a match, and a little piece of the striker to the backs of these thumb-sized cockroaches, push 'em out the door, and send 'em down the tier. I didn't believe him. Really? He said, convincingly. We had some good times, me and Charlie, smoking these thin little reefers. Suddenly he took my face in his big hands and kissed me on the forehead. I rose, pulled away, and went straight into the house. It turned out that both George and Charlie did know Bill. What are the odds? And Bill had been filled in about Charlie and the rest of us by Pearl. And Bill wasn't moving in like I thought he was, but living somewhere in the valley. Charlie's explorations for desert water led him to difficult places. At least once, dry and exhausted, he lay down, knowing the possibility of bodily death. Sweat evaporates in desert heat before you know it's there. A remarkable number of people found dead of dehydration had water in their canteens. Fearful of using the last of it, they drifted off, not recognizing the seriousness of their condition. After a rest, Charlie got up and found his way back to Barker's. Sandy. One day, as Charlie, Mary, and I walked up the wash to hike the steep hills, I was ahead of him and felt competitive. I wondered why he was not moving faster and in front of me. I began feeling disappointed that he was not more athletic and that I could outdo him. Eventually, I ran out of steam and was afraid of going where the rocks were loose and dangerous. He then sprinted easily past me. Charlie. Too much will is overdoing it. A body with a strong will fighting the hot desert would probably die. Like you're walking from one waterhole to another, and fear of death is pushing you, and your body is stiff and you're hard at work thinking and moving. Sweat comes from you and you think it's hell. But at peace, you enjoy a nice stroll. The willingness to die and give up, once you understand it, allows you to start over, strong as all life beyond death. On one exploration for water, Charlie had a revelation that he didn't talk about. Tex said he seemed to pull into himself, that there were things he couldn't or wouldn't say. My mind was confused. It was night. I was asleep in George's trailer, dreaming of thunder and wind. I woke up. It was not thunder and wind. It was horses. I could hear them breathing heavily as they ran by the windows. The cowboys were too far behind to keep them from stampeding onto the road. Everyone was coming out to help, running, yelling, getting into cars to give chase, but the horses got all the way to the freeway before anyone could stop them. And it wasn't until just before dawn that they could be caught in a culvert, and the panic of the exhausted men subsided. I didn't wonder how the horses got out, or why they stampeded. And I heard no speculation on the subject, but the ranch had been coming to turmoil. One day, Randy Starr ran into George's house like a demon. He began rummaging and slamming kitchen cupboards and drawers, daring George to say anything about it. He was thrilled to announce his discovery of a nest of pink baby mice in an unused bottom drawer. I don't know if my distress reached the air, only that Randy's face looked grotesque as over and over he plunged his fist down upon them. George told Randy that was enough, to leave the house and come back when he was sober. Randy strode out, firing threats about quitting, got into his Cadillac and drove away. Fortunately for George, he came back late at night, but for days he inflicted his torment on all within range, drinking to excess, yelling obscenities, and sealing in silence the things George most wanted to know. Benny left, Larry stunk of piss, and George began talking about selling the ranch. When Charlie returned from the desert, it was only a stopover between trips. He put Randy in place, somehow relieving him of the compulsion to self-destruct. He checked with me and the others of us, and went back to the desert, but he seemed unsettled. Sadie in the desert was restless. She decided that no one else should touch Zizo. She would give instruction as to how he was to be held. I think people tolerated her directions, but it didn't quiet her. She couldn't sit still. Finally, she went down the road in a huff, leaving Zizo and everyone else. She spotted 2 men in a jeep, took off her cap, unbuttoned her jacket, and put on an accent. "Southern dame in distress," she told me later. Her car was stuck, and she was just gonna leave the damned thing. Pretty soon, she showed up at the ranch. She and I slept in the trailer beside George's house. She'd leave and come back from town every few days to excitedly tell me about tuned-in people. Susan believed in signs, events and situations that give direction if you paid attention. One day her eyes grew large as she told me, The radio has been telling me to do things. In December of '68, George had me fire up the heater under the mantel. He fantasized a mountaintop Christmas. Someone brought him a little tree for the house, and he asked me to decorate it with dog biscuits. Dennis Wilson and Company had put the song Charlie had written for him on a 45 record, changing some of the words and the rhythm. It was a similar song in a different spirit, with a different message. Dennis had put his own name to it, probably for convenience, but he hadn't told Charlie that they were going to record it. I think that Charlie found out about that in the desert. At some point I heard the record, but I don't remember Charlie saying anything about it. The guys had been composing new music. Before the desert, our music had been, for the most part, a deep breathing exercise towards relaxation and release. We released words, but never wrote them down. What for? Suddenly, they were writing down chords and words, employing Leslie, the business school graduate, to take shorthand. Suddenly, they had a message to send, and the message mattered. Pictures become words. If I use words to unexplain the wide blue of the ocean and a tiny drop of rain. Valleys green and amber once were and still could be. Our lives are in the water. Its time runs fast into the sea. C. Manson, Unfinished Song, 1969. I cannot relate all the people who came in and went, where and when. I could not ever. Tex left one day to report to the draft board, and we didn't see or hear from him for 3 or 4 months. When almost everyone else was back on Spawn's ranch, they seemed to be on a mission. One of the girls told me that while around an outdoor fire, they'd had a sort of hog calling, selecting syllables to symbolize vehicles that could take us to and from the desert. They sent the sounds with the smoke into the universe. It was primitive style chanting, and not overly serious, but there was no doubt that these thoughts would manifest in physical form. Soon enough there would be shovelheads, knuckleheads, panheads, stock and chopped motorcycles in George's front yard. Most came with visitors, but TJ brought us a custom-made black 3-wheeled chariot with the word love and red script across the back. Charlie was driving the 3-wheeler around the valley one night, with 3 of us girls in the back, when, at a stoplight, we met Karate Dave on a rust-dusted Indian motorcycle, a nice old bike. Dave wasn't bad-looking either. He was atypically clean-cut, blonde and masculine, and he came home with us after a few more stoplights. Charlie called him Karate Dave after learning he had a black belt. The problem with Dave was that he wasn't done rebelling against authority figures. He was a military AWOL, and if he can be believed, he'd escaped the police twice after being handcuffed. Charlie told me that in order to respect his peers, Dave needed to be beaten at his art, and none of our guys was trained in the martial arts. Charlie said this to him: "Challenge yourself, man. Compete with yourself. You got more than 20 acres of hills, caves, and boulders to master. Can you run through here at night without breaking your foot or falling on your face? You can knock people down, but can you pass through a place without leaving a trace that you were there? Without disturbing a dog or a pebble? Challenge yourself, man." Dave had a good false ID, but he was another person who had to avoid the police. Bobby Beausoleil had gotten Sandy Good pregnant in the desert. This was big news because their relationship was not exactly dovey. She wanted to be with Charlie and resented or ignored invitations. Bobby once asked Sandy to bring him a pair of scissors, and she threw them at him. Sandy: Charlie could say, "Honey, could you give me a shirt?" And I'd feel privileged to be asked. But when Paul or Bobby said it, it could come across like egotistic male insensitivity, and I'd feel enraged. Charlie paid mind to genetics. I remember him saying only a few things that led me to that conclusion. One was his assessment of himself as not being the top of the line reproductively, and another was about Bobby Beausoleil being the prospective progenitor of beautiful kids. Prosecutors, in seeking to bolster the case against Charlie, would call him a racist. But people have been breeding themselves and their animals with health, abilities, and appearance in mind for centuries. One thing that Charlie said that seemed significant to me with regard to different races: he said that he didn't want the earth to lose its colors. I think he said that with regards to colors of the sky, water, trees, plants, and animals, but also the people. I never heard him express a desire to know his personal ancestry, but in the years since, it has been traced all the way back to the 17th century, and through the father he never knew, he is a legitimate son of the American Revolution. Sunstone, aka Bear, was blonde and blue-eyed like Mary. Whatever characteristics he'd received from Charlie had yet to manifest. The biggest part of Sunstone's day was in the struggle to pull himself up on the chairs, rocks, the porch, and, when tired, onto the hip of an available girl. At the Fountain of the World, he'd been inadvertently given attention for crying. Pudgy older women had rushed to sweep him into their flesh and feed him like a pet. At the ranch, when he dropped to the sand and cried, nobody came. It infuriated him. We encouraged him, but he wouldn't look us in the eyes. He cried as though we must be deaf, then as if to curse us for this outrage, and inside we cried, but we still didn't come. And then one day I saw him stand and fall, reach for a pebble, and after inspecting it, drop it, and move on. Soon he was walking, using us for balance. I remember him reaching to hold two of Katie's fingers, and she bent to allow him the lead. To follow the child, the gate of heaven is opened. To follow his every move with empathy of spirit, knowing that he is the king of his world. Without man's madness, he will fill his own mind with experience, and, not given to doubts and fears, he will extend his all. Patricia Krenwinkel, circa 1970. Letter from Sybil Brand Institute, LA County Women's Jail. I'm not of the school of the matriarch. I'm of the patriarch school of thought. I submit to intelligence and give up to the truth in all creatures, but I've never surrendered and never will surrender spirit. Hundreds of years ago, when I left Scotland, I said I would never surrender. Wherever I stand is the promised land, the holy land to me. I got forever where I am. You cannot be black or Japanese or any other than what you are. It is not a matter of one or the other being good or bad. It's not a matter of like or dislike. It is not a prejudgment. I love all, and all is me, but if there is no me, I love nothing. I love me first, and that's natural order. I know what I am, what was, is before me. Most of our fathers had little time for introspection or exploration, and little time with their families. They'd given the biggest parts of themselves to businesses and industries. We'd grown up with amenities and accoutrements far over and above mere food and good plumbing, but material goods were not the be-all and end-all for us. Modern society offered little purpose but earth-destroying jobs for money to buy substitutes for love and guard against the risks of experience. Who wanted to live in a world where the most exciting and meaningful pastime was shopping? Charlie once told Mary and me an old joke that fostered a common expression. A traveler stopping in an unfamiliar town was taken to a poker game, after which he said to his host, "You know they all cheat." The guy said, "Yeah, I know." The man asked, "Well then, why do you play?" And the guy replied, "It's the only game in town." Our parents never thought to question the works of businesses and industries. Not until significant damage was done to natural life were voices raised to stop them. Masses of our generation grew up wary of the money rush, but to our parents it was the only game in town. Our generation was the first to even consider alternatives. The way people act, they don't really like their jobs. Why don't they change the program to working 4 days a week and resting 3? Or rest half of every day? The time doesn't matter if you don't like your job. But how do you know unless you get experience? You could train for different jobs just like the old days when there were apprentices, and you'd work with an experienced person. And there could be places where you live and get training and necessary skills. Charlie said they had them during World War II. CCC camps. They could teach people to plant trees and to make useful and beautiful things, and be resourceful and grow food and plant trees. How are they going to make money doing that? For over 100 years, California's wealth had been tallied in precious metals, but its real fortune was in the variety of natural environments. From beaches to mountains to deserts, tidewater pools to freshwater lakes, pygmy forests to some of the tallest and largest trees in the world. Who would imagine these riches would need protection from the people they enrich and sustain? We loved California, and it was being ruined by too many cars, planes, factories, pesticides, herbicides, and whatever the industries could con people into buying. When Los Angeles' people finally admitted to smog so thick it could sicken, their answer was to cancel the school recess and keep the kids inside. Air and water ain't worth much. After all, it's everywhere. How could it fit on the stock exchange? We tried to keep our numbers down, but for everyone who remained in the desert or at the fountain of the world, another person arrived on the ranch. The person Pearl wanted there was not. Juan was in the desert. Pearl could be curt, disagreeable, a real tyrant, but with certain people, she was as perky as a professional performer. I saw this the first time Shorty Shay's car pulled up to the saloon. Pearl lit to such high wattage it raised our curiosity and some old ire in George. On their way past me into the house, Pearl informed me that Shorty was a stuntman for the movies, but she didn't elaborate or invite me in, so I stayed inside. Shorty Shay wasn't short. Next to me, he was on the tall side and burly. Something about him reminded me of a buffalo hunter. He seemed gregarious enough, another Irishman, but I could tell right away that George didn't like him. After the visit, George was tight-lipped. "Talks big," he grunted. I wondered if it was jealousy at the way Pearl bustled around Shorty, but I came to think it was more. George didn't say what precipitated this opinion, and I felt it was not my place to ask. Anyway, Shorty left, and Pearl went back to being unhappy. Some visitors George enjoyed. When he had the funds and the opportunity to buy a horse and was led outside to determine its fitness by feel, he was in business. When the rare call came for horses to fulfill the needs of a movie, no matter how small, he was in charge, giving instructions, sending Randy and crew to wrangle. Both George and Pearl welcomed horse owners and ranchers from surrounding communities, so I left the house to allow them privacy. But there were other visitors who came to snoop and gossip, both male and female. They came as old friends, but they were not really friendly. Not to us, and not to him. A ruddy ex-ranch hand with white blonde hair and calloused hands began visiting regularly in the evenings after Pearl had gone home. He sat across from George, making small talk and leaning back in his chair, putting his left ankle on his right knee, shifting his right ankle to his left knee, stretching out his muscular arms to glance at his watch, and at sundown reckoned he ought to get going. One evening in the half-light, Bobby and Charlie saw this man by the haystack loading bales of George's hay into a pickup truck, and they suspected it was not the result of a bona fide deal. Everyone knew George was barely getting by with 60 horses to feed. So when the guys confronted the man, offering him cash to pay George for the hay, he promptly put it back and never again came to take it. So George didn't have to know about it. That was John Swartz. He would be back in several months for a job. Sometime around January 1969, we moved to the suburbs. Charlie's friend Bill already had access to a 2-story house where some of us were staying part-time. But the reason we moved en masse was that George and I had an argument. 3 or 4 times after he had visitors, he told me that someone had referred to us as that bunch of hippies hanging around. "A lot of your friends have beards," he told me. I told him it was the fashion. He said, "Makes a place look bad." I let it pass, but one day he got testy about it. He said, "I've seen plenty of beards in my time, and they were usually on bums." So I told all the guys, and the next day all who showed at the front of the ranch were clean-shaven. Still, the negative prevailed, and George began to complain as if our guys were the cause of all his problems. I said, "Is this any way to treat friends? How can you listen to a bunch of strangers?" He said they were not strangers. Then he told me something that stung, and I didn't repeat it to anyone. After asking me how we got our money when so many of the men did not have jobs, he led on that he thought Charlie was foolish for giving money away. "Was he foolish for giving it to you?" I asked. He said, "Yes." This time I was furious. I yelled, "Well, do you want us all to leave?" And he was so stubborn and so mad, he said yes. We took 3 hours leaving, cleaning, packing, and petting the dogs. And as the 3-wheeler roared out of the drive with the last of us, the wind hit my face, and I saw the whole crazy, crooked ranch and wet bolts of color, and felt like I'd lost my world. In January of 1969, The U.S. inaugurated a new president. I don't know that any of us paid attention to politics, but we knew that the Beatles had just put out a new album. Down in the valley, the 2-story house that Bill leased had several bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a fireplace, electricity, and hot water from the tap. A lot of coats and muddy boots cluttered the storeroom near the back door, and the kitchen was scented with steaming food. It was a comfortable place, but the rain made me gloomy. I didn't know what to do with myself. Most of the guys huddled over instruments in the furnished living room, working on the new music. At night, after eating, the rest of us joined them to learn words and develop harmonies. One night, tired of the repetition, I clammed up. I didn't feel like singing. I was sitting on a tall stool, watching Sunstone eat a piece of chocolate. He toddled toward my white capris, holding out his hands, so I put a toe to his chest to block him, and he plopped down on his diapers. He was startled, but I felt like I was flying. Somehow I'd been catapulted 8 or 10 feet across the room and rolled against a wall. With a sideways view of the multiple eyes upon me, I heard Charlie say, "There, how do you like it?" I didn't feel hurt or defensive or contrite. I wasn't even embarrassed. I just got up, feeling cleared of an obstinate spirit, and when the music resumed, I sang. A tough East Coast girl we called Little Patty, the shorter of the 2 Patties, moved in with us. She had cropped dark hair and what someone described as a cookie dough complexion, but a smooth voice and a great smile that erased any doubt about her face. She was street smart and knew to listen before she spoke. But one day, as we were about to pass in the hallway, she approached me with that smile and spoke to me with that voice. And before I understood her intention, she pressed herself onto me, tenderly kissing my mouth. I smiled into her eyes and shook my head, and little Patty gracefully understood. Although the guys, being fewer, received the attention of more than one woman, and we women were comfortably physically affectionate, none of us lived together, demonstrated a desire for homosexuality, not to my knowledge. We had a makeshift bike shop in the garage, and bikers came to talk shop. Some belonged to outlaw clubs with satanic names that really had nothing to do with good and evil or the occult. Some of these guys were at ease with themselves and with us. Others hung back looking hostile. One day, Charlie commented ironically, "Jesus Christ, would have to be the devil to trick people out of their love." Another time he said, "Who would want to be with that stiff, sexless guy that got trapped in the church?" He and the guys eventually wrote a song that went in part like this: "I found Jesus and locked him in my cellar. Repeat. Was talking through a hole. Seems like a nice feller. He was locked up in the church house, locked up by the preacher's words. Repeat. Old preachers dress in black, you know. We see you, you silly birds. Those are the birds that spread the words that get down in your head. Repeat. They'll dirty up your mind and put you in your deathbed. Dominus vobiscum. If they don't pay friscum. We need more tanks to fight the Arabs." Excerpt, song lyrics, C. Manson et al., 1969. Many of us believed that some churchian, Robert Louis Stevenson, and the 100 years of Christianity had cut the manhood off of Jesus. I pictured Jesus as a kind of alternative lifestyle guy who ran with a lot of other masculine guys, maybe like the bikers. After all, the biblical Jesus was an alternative to the scribes and Pharisees. He was bringing the people back not just to the pious words, but to the Spirit. He was bringing them back to life. I don't think we had a Bible, but more than a few of us had been raised with one. After we heard the new Beatles album, someone got a Bible to check out passages that struck a chord and a chord. The new Beatles' White Album was as appealing as their others, but also different, with specific sounds between songs and the same sounds gathered in the piece titled Revolution 9. Most interesting were the sounds of gunfire, the grunts of pigs, the screams and moans of people dying, of people making love, a baby's babble, a black man yelling rise. The album was timely. We believed that the song Blackbird was written for the black race. We chuckled on hearing Sexy Sadie and wept with George Harrison's guitar. We acknowledged the genius that had created the album, but we did not believe that the Beatles were talking to us, unless you included us in the soul of the world. The album was just interesting.